Case 1, Alicia Pankey. December 23, 2018. Denver District Court. Denver, Colorado. The call that came into Denver Emergency Dispatch on the night of December 23, 2018, began the way so many calls to that center begin, with conflict, with a household in crisis, with the kind of domestic disturbance that Denver police officers had been trained to respond to and de-escalate. First responders pulled up to the Pankey residence that evening with the knowledge and experience of officers who had seen this kind of call before. They were prepared for what they expected. They were not prepared for what they were about to find. Or, more precisely, for what they were about to discover was missing. When officers entered the home of Alicia Pankey and her husband, Leland Pankey, they began working through the standard protocol that domestic calls demand, gathering names, establishing relationships, identifying who was present in the household, and whether everyone was accounted for. It was in the process of that accounting that the night shifted entirely. A child was not present. Alicia's 7-year-old son, Caden McWilliams, was not in his bedroom. He was not at a neighbor's home. He was not staying temporarily with a relative. He was simply not there. And when officers pressed for an explanation, a clear, simple, verifiable explanation for where a 7-year-old boy was on the night of December 23rd, the answers they received did not hold together. They did not add up. They did not satisfy the instinct of trained investigators who understood what an unsatisfactory answer about a missing child means. Caden McWilliams had been 7 years old. 7 is an age of visibility, of school attendance, of neighborhood friendships, of the daily rhythms that make children known to the communities they inhabit. A 7-year-old is in classrooms, on playgrounds, at bus stops. A 7-year-old leaves a trace of presence in the world that is difficult to erase quietly. And yet, as investigators began to work the timeline backward from that December night, the absence of Caden McWilliams from the record of daily life began to take a shape that was deeply troubling. A shape that suggested his disappearance from the world had gone unremarked and unaddressed for a period of time that no child welfare system should have allowed. Officers did not delay. A search warrant was obtained with urgency, and the search for Caden expanded outward from the Pankey home. Investigators followed the threads available to them, the family's associations, their routines, the storage unit rented in the Pankey name at a facility in Denver. When they arrived at that storage unit and broke the seal on it, what they encountered inside was something that no amount of investigative preparation fully equips a person for. Inside an animal carrier, the kind designed to transport household pets, the kind that sits unremarkably in the corners of garages and storage units across the country, were the remains of 7-year-old Caden McWilliams. His body had been encased in concrete. The concrete had been deliberately poured and set around the child, a deliberate act of concealment that spoke not of panic but of decision. Someone had planned this. Someone had taken the time to make this permanent. The forensic investigation that followed worked backward through the months to establish when Caden had lost his life. The evidence indicated that his death had occurred in approximately July of 2018, roughly 5 months before officers knocked on that door. 5 months. In those 5 months, Caden McWilliams had not been reported absent from school through any channel that triggered an emergency response. He had not been flagged through any child welfare mechanism. He had not been located by any of the institutional systems that exist for precisely this purpose. He had simply been gone, sealed in a storage unit in Denver, while the world around him continued without apparent awareness that he was missing from it. The investigation conducted by the Denver Police Department and prosecuted by the Denver District Attorney's Office was thorough and comprehensive. The physical evidence gathered at the storage facility, combined with the investigative work of detectives who reconstructed the timeline of Caden's disappearance, produced a case that established criminal accountability clearly and completely. Alicia Pankey was taken into custody. Her husband, Leland Pankey, was also arrested and faced his own charges before the court. In August of 2020, nearly 2 years after the discovery in that Denver storage unit, Alicia Pankey stood before the Denver District Court and entered a guilty plea to the charge of child abuse resulting in death. The court sentenced her to 32 years in a Colorado State correctional facility. Leland Pankey, prosecuted separately, received a sentence of 72 years in prison for his role in the events surrounding Caden's death and the concealment that followed. 32 years and 72 years. Numbers that represent the court's formal declaration that what happened to Caden McWilliams was among the gravest violations that the law of Colorado recognizes, a violation of the most fundamental obligation that exists between a parent and a child. Caden had been entrusted entirely to the adults in that household. His safety, his welfare, his very survival depended on the people who were supposed to protect him. That trust was not merely broken. It was shattered in a way that required investigators, a storage unit, and a search warrant to uncover. The case, in the years following the sentencing, became a focal point for serious institutional examination in Denver. When the question was asked, how does a 7-year-old disappear from public life for 5 months without a coordinated emergency response? The answers that emerged from school systems, from child welfare agencies, from neighborhood structures revealed the gaps that advocates had long been warning about. Attendance monitoring, cross-agency communication, the speed with which a missing child report escalates from a routine inquiry to a full emergency mobilization. All of it was examined in the light that Caden's case cast on the systems that had failed to find him in time. The reforms that followed were meaningful, but they were paid for at a cost that no reform process should ever have to pay, the cost of a 7-year-old boy's life. Caden McWilliams deserved school mornings. He deserved summer afternoons in Denver's parks and evenings watching whatever shows captured the imagination of 7-year-olds in 2018. He deserved the completely ordinary gift of growing up, of becoming a teenager, and then a young man, and then whatever he chose to be after that. All of it was taken from him by the people who were supposed to give him everything. Child welfare advocates throughout Colorado and across the country return consistently to the message that community awareness is not supplemental to institutional child protection. It is essential to it. Teachers who notice persistent absences. Neighbors who observe something that doesn't feel right. Family members who haven't heard a child's voice in longer than feels normal. Each of those observations, when acted upon, becomes a potential intervention. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline, reachable at 1-800-422-4453, is available around the clock every day of the year, staffed by trained counselors who receive reports and connect callers with the local resources that can turn an observation into action. No concern is too small. No instinct should be dismissed. Caden McWilliams was 7 years old. He was a child in every sense of the word, curious, dependent, full of the particular aliveness that belongs to children at that age. He deserved every protection that the adults around him were obligated to provide. The Court of Denver gave him the only accounting it could give, a verdict, a sentence, and the permanent inscription of his name in the legal record of a city that owed him better. That record stands. His name stands. And 32 years of accountability stands in his name, because the law of Colorado understood that what happened to him demanded nothing less. If Caden's story stayed with you, if it reminded you why this work of telling these stories matters, please take a moment right now to like this video, leave his name in the comments so the community here can honor him. These children deserve to be remembered by more than just a case number. They deserve a community that refuses to look away. Case 2. Kelsey Newell Skinner. December 21, 2014. Denver District Court. Denver, Colorado. There is an assumption embedded in the way emergency medical teams receive patients that is so fundamental it rarely gets spoken aloud. The assumption is this: the person who carries a child into a hospital is that child's advocate. They are frightened. They are desperate. They want help for this child more than they want anything else in the world. When Kelsey Newell Skinner walked through the entrance of Denver Health Medical Center on December 21, 2014, carrying her 2-month-old daughter, Natalie Hurst Skinner, the medical professionals who received them extended that assumption automatically and completely. A mother. A baby. A crisis that demanded immediate response. The team moved fast, the way trauma teams are trained to move, because with an infant in critical condition, every second carries weight. But as the physicians and nurses at Denver Health began their clinical assessment of baby Natalie, that assumption, the one about the advocate mother, the frightened parent seeking help, began to give way to something far more complicated and far more disturbing. What the medical examination revealed about 2-month-old Natalie Hurst Skinner's condition was not consistent with any accidental explanation. Natalie had sustained catastrophic skull fractures and multiple rib fractures. The medical professionals who documented those injuries understood their significance immediately and completely. Injuries of that nature and severity in a 2-month-old infant do not occur through mishap. The pediatric medical literature is unambiguous on this point, and the physicians at Denver Health knew it. The clinical picture they were looking at told a story of intentional harm that had been inflicted on a baby who had been alive in this world for only 8 weeks. Natalie did not survive. On December 21, 2014, 2-month-old Natalie Hurst Skinner lost her life. The injuries she had sustained were beyond what medical intervention could reverse. The team at Denver Health had done everything within the reach of medicine. It was not enough, because what had been done to Natalie before she arrived at that hospital was not something that medicine could undo. The mandatory reporting requirements that govern medical professionals in Colorado were immediately activated. Law enforcement was notified, and the Denver Police Department began the investigation that the circumstances demanded. Detectives worked to reconstruct the timeline of Natalie's 8 weeks of life, the household she had been brought home to, the people who had access to her, the events of the days and hours before she arrived at Denver Health with injuries that ended her life. The investigation identified Kelsey Newell Skinner as Natalie's mother and primary caregiver, as the person responsible for the harm that had taken the child's life. But as Denver investigators worked deeper into the circumstances of Natalie Hurst Skinner's short life and tragic death, they uncovered a second layer of this story that struck at something beyond the individual criminal act. This second layer involved a system, a government agency specifically designed and funded to protect children exactly like Natalie, and what that system had done, or more precisely what it had catastrophically failed to do. Natalie's family had been known to the Denver Department of Human Services before her death. A caseworker had been formally assigned to the family. This caseworker's professional responsibility included conducting regular safety checks, physical visits to the home to assess the child's well-being, to observe the living conditions, to make the direct human contact with the family that allows a trained professional to identify warning signs that written reports cannot capture. Those visits were supposed to be documented. Logs were supposed to be maintained. A paper trail of professional oversight was supposed to exist. When investigators pulled those records, those logs that were supposed to document a caseworker actively monitoring the safety of baby Natalie, what they found was not a record of diligent oversight. What they found was fabrication. The caseworker assigned to Natalie's family had falsified the safety and visitation logs completely. The visits had not occurred. The assessments had not been made. The professional engagement with the family that those documents purported to describe had not happened. A system that existed for the purpose of catching danger before it became death had, in the case of 2-month-old Natalie Hurst Skinner, been reduced to fiction written by the person whose job it was to make that system work. The revelation that a Denver Department of Human Services caseworker had fabricated months of child welfare records sent a wave of institutional shock through the department and through the city's government. The public response was immediate and fierce. The department came under intense scrutiny from city officials, from child advocacy organizations, from journalists, and from members of the Denver community who understood that the falsification of those records had not been a paperwork violation. It had been a failure with life or death consequences. Investigations into the department's supervisory structures, accountability mechanisms, and case management practices were launched. The questions of how a caseworker could fabricate records without detection, how supervisors had failed to catch the discrepancy, and how the monitoring of a 2-month-old infant in a high-risk household had been reduced to nothing. Those questions were asked with the urgency they deserved. The answers produced reforms. New protocols for supervisory review of case documentation. Cross-agency communication requirements. Enhanced accountability structures for the individual caseworkers responsible for the highest-risk cases. Those reforms represented genuine institutional change. But they arrived too late for Natalie. They arrived after the system had already failed her in the most absolute way possible. Kelsey Newell Skinner was charged with child abuse resulting in death. The Denver District Attorney's Office built a case supported by the medical documentation from Denver Health, the investigative findings of the Denver Police Department, and the broader context of a household in which a child welfare agency had been maintaining a fictional record of safety checks while a 2-month-old infant was in danger. Newell Skinner did not take the case to a jury. She entered a guilty plea before the Denver District Court, acknowledging the criminal responsibility that the evidence had established beyond dispute. In 2016, the court sentenced Kelsey Newell Skinner to 48 years in a Colorado State correctional facility. It was a sentence that the judge delivered with the solemnity appropriate to a case in which an 8-week-old infant had lost her life at the hands of the person charged with her protection. 48 years, nearly 5 decades of accountability imposed by the law of Colorado on behalf of a child who had lived for only 2 months. 2 months against 48 years. The disproportion between those numbers captures something essential about what the court understood it was doing in that sentencing. Natalie Hurst Skinner had been in this world for 61 days. She had not yet had the chance to become fully known to the people around her, to move beyond the first weeks of life into the stage where a baby's personality begins to emerge, where the first deliberate smiles appear, where the particular person a child is going to become starts to be visible. She had been cheated of all of it. Not by accident, not by illness, not by any of the ordinary tragedies that claim young lives, but by the deliberate choice of someone who should have protected her. The Denver Department of Human Services caseworker who falsified the records faced consequences through the department and through the legal mechanisms available for professional misconduct. But the most lasting consequence of that falsification lives in the reform record of the department, in the changes made to ensure that what happened to Natalie, the complete breakdown of institutional oversight that her case exposed, could not be replicated in the cases of the children who came after her. For the community, the Natalie Hurst Skinner case is a reminder of something that child welfare advocates repeat consistently and urgently. Institutional systems require community support to function effectively. When a neighbor observes something concerning, when a family member senses that a child is in a situation that warrants attention, when a community member has information that could reach a caseworker or a law enforcement officer, that information matters. It fills the gaps that institutional systems leave. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4453 exists to receive exactly that kind of information from exactly the kind of person who isn't sure whether their concern rises to the level of a report but knows that something doesn't feel right. Natalie Hurst Skinner was 2 months old. Her name is in the court record of Denver permanently, inscribed by a process of legal accountability that took the full weight of a 48-year sentence to express. That is the law's tribute to a child who never had the chance to grow into her name. The community's tribute is simpler: to remember her, to say her name, and to carry forward the obligation to be the neighbor, the family member, the community member who acts when something feels wrong. Please like this video in honor of Natalie. Leave her name in the comments so this community can hold her memory, because these stories deserve to be told with the care and seriousness they require. Case 3, Juanita Kinsey. May 2008. Remains discovered January 2009. Logan County District Court. Sterling, Colorado. The high plains of northeastern Colorado are a landscape of extraordinary openness. Wide sky, flat land stretching to the horizon. Communities small enough that the rhythms of daily life are visible to anyone paying attention. Sterling, the seat of Logan County, is that kind of town. It is a place where people know one another, where the absence of a familiar face from the familiar places of daily life registers more quickly than it might in a larger city. It is, by the very nature of its size and its social density, a place where a 3-year-old child's disappearance from the community fabric should have been impossible to sustain without notice. And yet, in the spring of 2008, in the ordinary-looking home of Juanita Kinsey, 3-year-old Caleb Pacheco lost his life. And for nearly 9 months afterward, no one found him. No one came to the right door. No system flagged the right alarm. No institution mobilized the emergency response that a missing 3-year-old demands. Caleb Pacheco lay hidden beneath the mobile home where he had lived, and the world above that hiding place continued without recovering him until January of 2009. Caleb was 3 years old in May of 2008. 3-year-olds inhabit the world with a fullness that is impossible to disguise. They speak in short, emphatic declarations. They have preferences and protests. They make noise and demand attention, and fill the spaces they occupy with the particular energy of children who are just beginning to understand that the world extends beyond their immediate surroundings. Caleb Pacheco was that kind of child, alive, present, dependent on the adults around him for everything, and living in a household where the adult responsible for his care chose to end that life rather than sustain it. The details of what Juanita Kinsey did after her son lost his life speak to a decision-making process that investigators found deeply troubling. She did not seek help. She did not contact emergency services. She did not reach out to family members or to anyone in a position to provide assistance or accountability. Instead, she took the child's body, wrapped it with deliberate care, and concealed it beneath the mobile home where they lived. She placed her son's remains under the floor of the place he had called home, and she continued her daily life above that concealment with a consistency that, for nearly 9 months, prevented anyone from discovering what had occurred. Spring turned to summer in Sterling. Summer became autumn, the school year that Caleb would have been approaching with the developmental milestones of a soon-to-be preschooler, came and went. Neighbors went about their routines. The structures of community life that should serve as the earliest warning systems for child welfare emergencies did not produce the alarm that Caleb's situation required. The specific mechanisms by which a 3-year-old's disappearance from Sterling's community life failed to trigger an emergency-level response became one of the painful institutional questions that the case ultimately raised. Questions with no comfortable answers and no simple explanations. It was not until January of 2009 that investigators, working with agents from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, located Caleb Pacheco's remains beneath the mobile home in Sterling. The discovery transformed the investigation from a missing child case into a homicide case, and Juanita Kinsey became the subject of the criminal proceedings that followed in the Logan County District Court. The case built by Logan County prosecutors and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation established the facts of what had occurred with the specificity and evidentiary rigor that a first-degree criminal prosecution requires. The physical evidence recovered at the scene, the timeline of Caleb's disappearance from community life, and the circumstances of the concealment that had prevented his discovery for 9 months formed the core of a case that Juanita Kinsey ultimately did not contest at trial. In 2011, Kinsey appeared before the Logan County District Court and entered a guilty plea to the charge of second-degree murder for the death of her 3-year-old son, Caleb Pacheco. The court sentenced her to 48 years in a Colorado State Correctional Facility, a sentence that the judge imposed with the full recognition of what it represented. The court's accounting for the life of a child who had been given no protection by the person most obligated to provide it. 48 years. It is a number that the legal system produced through its assessment of the severity of the crime and the circumstances surrounding it. Against that number sits another, 3 years. The age of Caleb Pacheco when he lost his life. 3 years of curiosity and noise, and the completely ordinary miracle of a child discovering the world around him. 3 years, and then silence beneath a mobile home in Sterling, Colorado, for 9 months, until investigators found him and gave his story the formal accounting it demanded. The Kinsey case prompted serious reflection among child welfare advocates and policymakers in Colorado about the particular vulnerabilities of rural child welfare systems. Smaller communities have fewer institutional resources. They have fewer mandatory reporters in the daily contact with children that creates multiple opportunities for concern to be registered. They have greater distances between the offices of social services agencies and the homes those agencies are supposed to be monitoring. The specific combination of factors that allowed Caleb's absence from the world to go unaddressed for 9 months is not unique to Sterling. It reflects a structural challenge in rural child protection that advocates continue to work to address. In communities across Colorado and across the country, the response to that structural challenge is community-level vigilance. Neighbors who ask questions. Family members who push when the answers don't satisfy them. Teachers and program workers who escalate concerns through the channels available to them. And individuals who know something is wrong but are uncertain what to do. Who can call the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4453 and speak with a trained counselor who can help them understand what steps are available and what the right next action is. Caleb Pacheco was 3 years old. He should have grown up on those wide northeastern Colorado plains, under that enormous sky, in the community that should have been his home for decades. He was failed by the person who was his entire world. He was failed, too, by the gaps in a system that was designed to find children in danger but did not find him in time. The Court of Logan County gave him 48 years of accountability in his name. This community, the community of people who choose to learn these stories and carry them forward, gives him something the court cannot. The insistence that his name be remembered, that his 3 years of life be honored, that the story of what happened to him be told so that it contributes, in some small way, to the protection of the children who come after him. Caleb deserved everything that was taken from him. Remember his name. Please like this video, drop Caleb's name in the comments to honor his memory. Case 4, Melissa Wayne. January 17th through 18th, 2026. Denver District Court, Denver, Colorado. When emergency services received the call from a residence in Denver in the early hours of January 18th, 2026, the address they were dispatched to told part of the story before they even arrived. The building was described in subsequent reports as dilapidated, a structure whose visible deterioration spoke to a level of neglect that extended beyond the physical condition of the walls and floors to the circumstances of the people living within them. First responders arrived at that address and found a 2-year-old girl who was not responsive. She was transported immediately to medical care. But the injuries she had sustained during the preceding hours were of a severity that placed her beyond the reach of what emergency medicine could do for her. She did not survive. The medical examination that followed documented the physical evidence of what had been done to this 2-year-old child in the hours before emergency services were called. The documentation was extensive and deeply disturbing to the professionals who compiled it. The child's body bore severe bruising across multiple areas, the kind of bruising pattern that medical examiners and forensic professionals recognize immediately as evidence of repeated harm rather than isolated injury. This was not the documentation of a single terrible moment. This was the documentation of something sustained, something that had gone on across a period of time long enough to leave marks in multiple places on a body that weighed, at 2 years old, perhaps 25 pounds. But the medical evidence, as devastating as it was only one dimension of the picture that investigators assembled in the hours and days following the child's death. The second dimension came from the people who had been present in that Denver building, the roommates who shared the structure with Melissa Wayne, her daughter, and Wayne's boyfriend, Nicholas Stout. Those roommates gave investigators accounts of what they had heard during the hours before the emergency call was made. They had heard sounds of a child in distress. They had heard those sounds continue, not for minutes, but for an extended period, for hours, the kind of sustained distress that cannot be mistaken for ordinary childhood upset. They had heard what happened, and they had heard the silence that eventually followed. And they had not called for help in time. When investigators spoke with Melissa Wayne, when they sat with her and asked the direct, unavoidable questions that law enforcement asks in the aftermath of a child's death, the account she gave was one of the most difficult admissions in the police report. Wayne told investigators that she had been present in that residence while her boyfriend, Nicholas Stout, subjected her 2-year-old daughter to the harm that would end the child's life. She had been there. She had known what was happening. She had watched. She had not intervened. She had not called emergency services. She had not placed herself between the child and the person causing the harm. She had sat and watched, and her daughter had paid the price of that inaction with her life. Nicholas Stout was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and fatal child abuse, the most severe charges available to Colorado prosecutors, reflecting the direct role he played in the events that took this 2-year-old child's life. But Melissa Wayne's legal accountability was its own and distinct. Colorado law is clear on the criminal responsibility of a parent who is present, aware of harm being inflicted on their child, and capable of intervening or summoning help. The failure to act, when a child's life is in danger and a parent chooses an action, is itself a criminal act. Wayne was charged with child abuse resulting in death. The charge did not require proving that she had directly harmed her daughter. Her own account of her presence and her deliberate inaction was sufficient for the prosecution to proceed. Melissa Wayne was arrested in January of 2026. As of the time this documentary was produced, her case is actively proceeding through the Denver District Court. Nicholas Stout's case is simultaneously before the court on the graver charges of first-degree murder and fatal child abuse. The formal process of legal accountability is underway, and it is being pursued with the full weight of the charges the evidence supports. This case raises a question that advocates, legal scholars, and community members discuss with increasing urgency and moral seriousness. What is the legal and moral responsibility of a bystander when a child is in danger? The roommates in that Denver building heard what was happening. Melissa Wayne was present when it was happening. The law of Colorado has a clear answer for the parent in that situation. Presence and awareness and inaction constitute criminal responsibility. The law's answer for witnesses outside the immediate family relationship is more complex. But the moral answer, the community answer, is not complex at all. When a child is in danger, the call to emergency services is not optional. It is not something to weigh against other considerations. It is the one thing that a human being in proximity to a child in danger is obligated to do. The sounds that carried through the walls of that Denver building on the night of January 17, 2026, were the sounds of a child who needed help. The silence that followed those sounds was the silence of a child who no longer could. Between the sounds and the silence was a window in which a call to 911 could have changed the outcome. That window closed. This 2-year-old girl did not survive. Colorado provides legal protection for individuals who report suspected child abuse in good faith. The fear of being wrong, the reluctance to intervene in what might be characterized as someone else's private situation, is understandable as a human response. But it is a response that must be overridden when the sounds coming through a wall are the sounds of a small child in sustained distress. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4453 is one option. A direct call to 911 is another. Both are available, both are appropriate, and both are infinitely preferable to the silence that allowed this child's final hours to pass without intervention. This 2-year-old girl deserved fierce and uncompromising protection from every adult in her world. She deserved a mother who would have placed herself between harm and her child without hesitation. She deserved neighbors who would have called the moment they recognized the sounds of a child in sustained danger. The court proceedings in Denver will carry the formal accountability forward through the legal process. The community carries something else forward, the commitment to be the neighbor, the witness, the bystander who does not wait, who does not rationalize, who picks up the phone. If this case reached you, if it reminded you of what is at stake in every moment a child is in danger, please like this video, leave a comment. These stories need to be heard. These children need to be remembered. And the lessons in these stories need to reach the people who can act on them. Case 5, Alexis Nelson. May 2023. Arapahoe County District Court. Aurora, Colorado. The chain of events that ultimately brought Alexis Nelson before the Arapahoe County District Court began not with a police investigation, not with a neighbor's report, not with any of the institutional mechanisms that are supposed to catch children in danger. It began with a grandmother who lived out of state, far from Aurora, Colorado, far from the apartment where her 5-year-old granddaughter, Mahalie Hobbs, was supposed to be living her childhood life. A grandmother who had not heard her granddaughter's voice in a period of time that had moved past concerning into something that kept her awake, that settled in her chest with the particular weight of a fear she could not dismiss. That grandmother did what love requires when the ordinary channels of contact fail and the silence has gone on too long. She called for a welfare check. Aurora Police Department officers responded to the apartment of Alexis Nelson in May of 2023. They knocked. They identified themselves. They explained the purpose of their visit. And then they asked the question that the grandmother's call had made necessary. Where is Mahalie? Where is the 5-year-old girl who lives at this address? The response they received from Alexis Nelson was not the response of a mother caught off guard by an unexpected question. It was a prepared response, a story with enough structure to suggest it had been rehearsed. Nelson told the officers that Mahalie had been put up for adoption. Legally, she said, through the appropriate channels. The child was gone, properly placed, no longer her responsibility. The officers at that door were trained to do exactly what they did next, to ask for documentation. Legal adoptions generate paperwork. They involve agencies, caseworkers, courts, signed documents, reference numbers that can be verified with a single phone call. Nelson could provide none of it. The adoption story, under the basic scrutiny of professional investigators, did not survive contact with the questions that scrutiny demands. Aurora Police Department investigators pursued the inconsistency with the urgency that a missing 5-year-old demands. What they found inside that Aurora apartment was something that altered the direction of everyone in that building permanently. In a utility closet, investigators discovered the remains of a child, Remains that forensic examination would confirm were those of Mahalie Hobbs, 5 years old. The remains had been concealed inside a plastic bag. An examination of the apartment's fireplace produced additional bone fragments. Mahalie Hobbs had not been adopted. She had not been placed with a loving family in a different state. She had not been given a new life somewhere beyond the reach of the grandmother who had been trying to find her. She had never left that apartment, and what remained of her had been deliberately, methodically concealed by the person who should have protected her more fiercely than anyone else in the world. The investigation conducted by the Aurora Police Department and prosecuted by the Arapahoe County District Attorney's Office was comprehensive and detailed. Every piece of evidence collected at the scene, every element of the timeline of Mahalie's disappearance from any record of public or family life, every aspect of the deliberate deception that Nelson had maintained, including the false account she had provided to officers at her door, was assembled into a prosecution that addressed the full scope of what had occurred. 3 distinct criminal acts were identified and charged. The second-degree murder charge that addressed Mahalie's death, the tampering charge that addressed the concealment of her remains, and the charge of attempting to influence a public servant that addressed the false adoption story Nelson had delivered to the Aurora Police Department officers who came to find her daughter. Each charge reflected a separate decision that Alexis Nelson had made. The decision to cause her daughter's death. The decision to conceal the evidence of that death. The decision to lie to law enforcement officers who were trying to find a missing child. 3 decisions, each compounding the harm of the one before, each demonstrating a quality of deliberateness that the Arapahoe County Court addressed head-on in the sentencing. In June of 2024, Alexis Nelson appeared before the Arapahoe County District Court and entered guilty pleas to all 3 charges. The court's response was one of the most substantial sentencing outcomes in Colorado's recent history for a case of this nature. Nelson was sentenced to 84 years in a Colorado State Correctional Facility. 84 years. A sentence that the court calibrated not just to the death of Mahalie Hobbs, but to the totality of what Nelson had done in the aftermath of that death. The concealment, the deception, the systematic effort to erase a 5-year-old child from the world's memory and to prevent the grandmother whose love had started everything from ever learning the truth. All of it was weighed by the court and reflected in a sentence that will keep Alexis Nelson incarcerated for the remainder of her functional adult life. Mahalie Hobbs was 5 years old. 5 is an age that sits at the very beginning of the years that a child begins to remember. The kindergarten year, the first full sentences read from a book, the first genuine friendships formed outside the family unit. 5-year-olds are beginning to build the foundation of the memories that will follow them through a lifetime. Mahalie never had the chance to build those memories, to carry them forward, to grow into the person she was already becoming at the time she was lost. But there is something in this case that must be named and honored alongside the tragedy. The grandmother's instinct. The grandmother who was too far away to reach her granddaughter directly, who had no institutional authority to demand answers, who had only love and the unshakable knowledge that something was wrong, and who acted on that knowledge by making the call that started everything. That call is the reason Mahalie's story is known. That call is the reason the investigation happened. That call is the reason the Arapahoe County District Court was able to impose 84 years of accountability in a 5-year-old girl's name. For anyone watching who has ever had that feeling, the feeling that a child in your life or your family or your community is not where they should be, is not being seen, is absent from the world in a way that doesn't resolve itself with easy explanations. The grandmother in this case is the model. The call that feels like it might be unnecessary, the welfare check that might be an overreaction, the report to a hotline that might be based on nothing. Those calls are never wasted. They are the starting point for every investigation that finds a child who needed to be found. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4453 is there for exactly that moment, exactly that feeling, exactly that decision point between silence and action. Mahalie Hobbs deserved her grandmother's love for a lifetime. She deserved the decades the law of Arapahoe County could not give her back. What the court gave her was accountability, permanent, documented, 84 years of accountability, inscribed in the legal record of Colorado in her name. And what this community gives her is the commitment to remember her, to say her name, and to carry the lesson of her grandmother's courage forward into every situation where a child's silence has gone on too long. Please like this video in honor of Mahali. Leave her name in the comments so this community can hold her memory. Every child in these stories deserves an audience that listens and remembers. Case 6. Jolene Baer LaCrue. August 2020. Denver District Court. Denver, Colorado. Gianna Rosales was 9 months old in August of 2020, and the people who loved her had already given her the nickname that would follow her name through every news report, every court document, every community conversation about what happened to her. They called her Gigi. At 9 months, a baby is at a threshold, old enough to respond to the world around her with recognition and preference, and the early vocabulary of infant communication, young enough to still be entirely dependent on the adults in her life for every element of her survival. Gigi was at that threshold when she was brought to Denver Health Medical Center in August of 2020 with injuries that the trauma team who received her recognized immediately as being of a severity inconsistent with any accidental explanation. The medical professionals at Denver Health worked with the urgency that a critically injured 9-month-old infant demands. They documented what they found with clinical precision. They did everything within their professional capacity to provide the care that Gigi needed. It was not sufficient. The internal injuries that Gigi had sustained were of a nature and a severity that placed her beyond the reach of what medicine could reverse. 9-month-old Gianna Rosales, Gigi, did not survive. She lost her life at Denver Health Medical Center in August of 2020. The mandatory reporting protocols that govern medical institutions in Colorado brought law enforcement into the situation immediately. The Denver Police Department launched an investigation into the circumstances of Gigi's death with the seriousness the medical findings demanded. The investigation focused on the household Gigi had come from, the people who had been responsible for her care in the hours and days before her arrival at Denver Health, and the timeline of events that culminated in the injuries that ended her life. 2 individuals were identified by investigators as the subjects of criminal scrutiny: Jolene Baer LaCrue, Gigi's mother, and King Gallardo, Baer LaCrue's boyfriend. Both were taken into custody. Both were charged with child abuse resulting in death. The cases of the 2 defendants were handled through the Denver District Court, but they were prosecuted separately, and the outcomes they produced were dramatically and painfully different. King Gallardo's case proceeded to trial. The evidence that Denver prosecutors assembled against him was presented to a Denver jury, who heard the full account of what had happened to 9-month-old Gigi Rosales, and who deliberated on the question of Gallardo's criminal responsibility for her death. The jury returned a conviction on the charge of child abuse resulting in death, and the court sentenced King Gallardo to 40 years in a Colorado State Correctional Facility. The verdict and the sentence represented the jury's determination that the evidence established Gallardo's direct criminal responsibility for what had been done to Gigi. Jolene Baer LaCrue also went to trial before a Denver jury, and the outcome of that trial was something that the Denver community, and particularly the advocates who had followed Gigi's case, received with profound difficulty. On February 20th, 2024, more than 3 years after Gigi's death, after a trial in which the prosecution had presented the full scope of its evidence, the Denver jury returned a verdict of not guilty on all charges against Jolene Baer LaCrue. She was acquitted. She walked out of the courthouse a free woman under the law, having been found not guilty by the 12 citizens who had heard all the evidence and who had determined that the legal standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt had not been established as to her specific criminal culpability. The acquittal of Jolene Baer LaCrue is a fact that sits in permanent, uncomfortable tension with the other facts of this case. It sits alongside Gigi's medical record. It sits alongside King Gallardo's 40-year sentence. It sits alongside the grief of everyone who loved Gianna Rosales and who followed the 3-year legal process in her name. The acquittal does not erase any of those other facts. It does not alter the medical documentation of what Gigi endured. It does not change the verdict against Gallardo. What it reflects is the particular functioning of the American criminal justice system, the burden of proof that the prosecution carries, the requirement that guilt be established beyond a reasonable doubt before a conviction is recorded, and the ultimate authority of a jury to determine whether that standard has been met. For communities, for advocates, For the people who follow cases like Gigi's and who feel the anguish of a verdict that does not match the understanding of what occurred, the acquittal of one defendant alongside the conviction of another is one of the hardest outcomes the legal system produces. It does not mean that the truth is unknown. It means that the legal standard for recording that truth in the form of a criminal conviction was not met, as the jury assessed the evidence before them. The distinction is real and it matters. And it lives alongside the permanent, unchangeable fact of what happened to 9-month-old Gigi Rosales. Gianna Rosales deserved to reach her first birthday. She deserved to take her first steps on the floors of a home where she was safe. She deserved to grow up and to become the person that 9-month-old Gigi, with her nickname already in place, with the love of family already wrapped around her, was going to be. King Gallardo will spend 40 years in a Colorado correctional facility in her name. The court gave what accountability it could build from the evidence available to it. And the community gives Gigi what no court can. The refusal to let her name be reduced to a case number. The insistence that she be remembered as a child who mattered completely and who deserved everything she never received. If you are a caregiver or community member concerned about the safety of a young child, please know that the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4453 is available at any hour. A concern shared with trained counselors can begin a process of intervention that changes an outcome. Gigi's story reminds us that those calls matter, that the window of opportunity to protect a child is real and finite, and must be acted on before it closes. Please like this video in Gigi's honor. Leave her name in the comments. These stories deserve to be carried forward by a community that takes them seriously. Case 7. Hannah Gilmore. September 2022. Sentenced November 12, 2025. Douglas County District Court. Littleton, Colorado. At the center of the case of Hannah Gilmore is a legal and moral principle that the Douglas County District Attorney's Office argued with precise and unrelenting force throughout the prosecution, and that the jury who heard the evidence ultimately accepted in full: a parent's duty to act, not the duty to refrain from causing harm. That is the most basic obligation the law imposes on every person. The duty being invoked in this case is something more specific and more demanding. It is the duty to intervene, to seek help, to prioritize the life of a child in danger over every other consideration, including the fear of personal legal consequence, including the instinct towards self-protection, including the paralysis that crisis sometimes produces in people confronted with a situation they have caused or contributed to. The duty to act, when a child is in danger and a parent is present, is a legal obligation in Colorado that the Gilmore prosecution treated as foundational to everything that followed. Hannah Gilmore's son, Leighton, was 22 months old in September of 2022. 22 months is an age of relentless motion and discovery. Toddlers at that developmental stage are exploring their physical environment with a thoroughness and a persistence that exhausts the adults trying to keep up with them. They pull things off tables. They reach into bags and pockets and containers. They pick things up from floors. They put things in their mouths, because that is how children at that age process and understand the physical world around them. It is a stage of development that requires constant vigilance from the adults responsible for their safety, not because children at that age are doing anything wrong, but because the world they are exploring with such enthusiasm contains dangers they cannot yet assess for themselves. On a day in September of 2022, inside Hannah Gilmore's apartment in Littleton, Colorado, 22-month-old Leighton Gilmore found something. Investigators and prosecutors established, through the evidence compiled in the case, that the child found a pill containing fentanyl. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid of extraordinary potency, a substance so powerful that a quantity invisible to the naked eye can be fatal to an adult, and that poses catastrophic risk to a small child whose body has no tolerance to it whatsoever. The presence of a fentanyl-containing pill in a location accessible to a 22-month-old was itself a child safety failure of the most serious kind. But what followed that failure? What Hannah Gilmore did, or rather chose not to do, in the moments after her son found that pill, was the foundation of the criminal case against her. Prosecutors established through the evidence that Gilmore knew Leighton had found the pill. She was aware of what he had picked up, and she pulled it from his mouth, a response that, in isolation, sounds like the action of a parent intervening to protect her child. But Gilmore did not call for emergency medical assistance after removing the pill from Layton's mouth. She did not take her son immediately to a medical facility. She did not describe the incident to emergency services, who could have initiated the treatment protocol that might have saved Layton's life. Instead, prosecutors argued, she delayed. She made the calculation, conscious or not, immediate or gradual, that calling for help would expose her to legal consequences she was not prepared to face. She chose to manage the situation herself. And Layton Gilmore, 22 months old, lost his life. The forensic evidence that investigators gathered established the cause of Layton's death as massive acute fentanyl ingestion, medical documentation that confirmed the substance involved, and the mechanism of harm. Evidence was also gathered indicating that Gilmore had taken steps to conceal the circumstances of Layton's condition and death from the law enforcement officers who would ultimately investigate the case. The concealment, the deliberate effort to obscure the facts of what had occurred and to prevent the investigation from reaching the truth, became a central element of the prosecution's case alongside the primary charge of child abuse resulting in death. Hannah Gilmore was prosecuted in the Douglas County District Court. The case went to a jury, 12 Douglas County citizens who heard the full presentation of evidence from both the prosecution and the defense, and who deliberated on the question of Gilmore's criminal responsibility. The jury returned a conviction on the charge of felony child abuse resulting in death. It was a verdict that accepted the prosecution's argument that Gilmore's decision to delay medical intervention, made in the knowledge that her son had been exposed to a dangerous substance and was at risk, constituted the criminal abandonment of the parental duty to act that Colorado law requires. Sentencing took place on November 12, 2025, more than 3 years after Layton's death in September of 2022. The Douglas County Court sentenced Hannah Gilmore to 36 years in a Colorado State Correctional Facility. 36 years for the decision not to make a phone call. 36 years for the choice to delay, to conceal, to prioritize personal consequence over the life of a 22-month-old boy who had found something dangerous and who needed his mother to get him help immediately. 36 years. A sentence that the court imposed with the understanding that Colorado law takes the parental duty to protect a child with the seriousness that the vulnerability of children demands. A parent who knows their child is in medical danger and who chooses not to seek emergency care is not a passive bystander. They are an active participant in the harm that follows. The Douglas County Court's sentence said that with clarity. Layton Gilmore was 22 months old. He was almost 2. Close enough to that threshold that his mother had likely begun thinking about what his second birthday would look like, what cake, what candles, what friends and family gathered around a child who was very nearly at the age of the 2-year-old's particular, dramatic, joyful selfhood. Layton never reached that birthday. He never had the chance to grow into the energy and the humor and the emerging personality that 22-month-olds carry like a promise of who they are going to become. He was failed not by accident or by the randomness of tragedy, but by the deliberate choice of an adult who knew he needed help and did not get it for him. The Gilmore case carries a message for families and caregivers that the medical and public health communities reinforce consistently. In a situation involving possible exposure to any controlled substance or dangerous material, the call to emergency services must be immediate. The fear of legal consequence. The fear of what calling 911 might mean for a person who has dangerous substances in their home is not a legally or morally acceptable reason to delay medical care for a child. Emergency responders are trained to prioritize the patient. The child's survival is the only relevant consideration in the moment of crisis. The legal consequences that follow a truthful call to emergency services are categorically less severe than the legal consequences of a child's death that a timely call could have prevented. For parents, for caregivers, for anyone responsible for the daily welfare of a small child. If there is any possibility that a child has been exposed to a dangerous substance, call 911. Call immediately. Do not manage the situation. Do not wait to see if symptoms develop. Do not calculate the personal cost of the call. Call. Layton Gilmore's life and the 36 years of accountability that the Douglas County Court imposed in his name are the permanent record of what happens when that call is not made. Please like this video to honor Layton Gilmore. Share it with someone who needs to hear this story. These stories of loss and accountability exist so that communities can learn from them, and so that the children at their center can be remembered with the dignity they deserve. Case 8. Kimberly Singler. December 19, 2023. El Paso County District Court. Colorado Springs, Colorado. The call that brought Colorado Springs police officers to the Singler residence on December 19, 2023, was a report of a residential burglary. That is the call that went into dispatch. That is what the officers responding to the address were prepared to investigate. A home that had been broken into, property that had been taken, the kind of crime that Colorado Springs law enforcement handles regularly, and that follows a well-established investigative protocol. Officers arrived at the Singler home expecting to document a crime scene and take a report. What they found inside that house was something so far beyond the parameters of a residential burglary that the officers on the scene immediately understood they were standing in a fundamentally different kind of investigation. Inside the Singler residence, the bodies of 2 children were discovered. Kimberly Singler's 9-year-old daughter and her 7-year-old son. A third child, an 11-year-old daughter, was found alive but with injuries severe enough to require immediate hospitalization. 3 children, 2 of them gone, 1 clinging to survival. And the scene they had been found in was constructed to look like a burglary. That last detail, the staging, was something that experienced investigators identified quickly. The physical evidence at the scene, when examined with the systematic attention that homicide investigators bring to a crime scene, did not tell the story of a residential burglary gone catastrophically wrong. It told the story of a scene that had been arranged to suggest a burglary, to create a narrative of external intrusion that would direct investigative attention away from what had actually occurred inside that home. Someone had constructed the burglary story deliberately and with some attention to its surface plausibility. But it did not hold up under the scrutiny of the El Paso County investigators who examined it with the full weight of professional forensic analysis. Kimberly Singler was not at the residence when officers arrived. She had left Colorado. By the time investigators had established the facts of what had occurred inside that Colorado Springs home and had identified Singler as the subject of a homicide investigation, she had not only left the state, she had left the country. She had flown to Europe. The woman who had staged a burglary scene in the home where 2 of her children had lost their lives was now on another continent, and the investigation that El Paso County had launched became an international manhunt that crossed an ocean. Law enforcement coordination between Colorado authorities, federal agencies, and international partners produced results with a speed that reflected the seriousness with which every agency involved treated the situation. On December 30, 2023, 11 days after the discovery in Colorado Springs, British authorities arrested Kimberly Singler in London, United Kingdom. The international manhunt that had begun in a Colorado Springs residential neighborhood ended in Britain, with Singler in custody and the extradition process initiated. The extradition of Kimberly Singler back to Colorado was the next step in a legal process that moved with the seriousness of its subject matter. She was returned to Colorado to face the charges that El Paso County prosecutors had prepared, multiple counts of first-degree murder, charges that reflected the prosecution's assessment of the deliberate nature of what had occurred in that Colorado Springs home and the premeditated construction of the false burglary narrative designed to conceal it. As of the time this documentary was produced, the case against Kimberly Singler is proceeding through the El Paso County District Court. The legal process that began with the discovery on December 19, 2023, continues through the formal mechanisms of Colorado's criminal justice system. The 11-year-old daughter who survived, who was hospitalized with severe injuries, carries forward the physical and emotional reality of what occurred in that home in ways that the legal proceedings cannot fully address, but that the support structures available to survivors of family trauma can begin to help with. The international dimension of this case, the flight from Colorado to Europe, the British arrest, the extradition, added a layer of complexity that is unusual even within the category of serious violent crime. But for investigators, the staging of the scene and the subsequent flight were not simply logistical complications. They were evidence of consciousness of guilt, the behavior of someone who understood that what had occurred in that home would be recognized as a crime and who took deliberate steps to obscure it and then to place herself beyond the reach of the jurisdiction responsible for investigating it. Those steps were ultimately ineffective. The El Paso County investigation penetrated the staged scene. British authorities responded to the international warrant. The extradition process returned Singler to Colorado. The law, moving through its international mechanisms, reached exactly as far as it needed to reach. A 9-year-old daughter, a 7-year-old son, 2 children who lost their lives inside a home that should have been the safest place in their world. An 11-year-old who survived to face a recovery process of extraordinary difficulty. These are the human facts at the center of this case. Not the international manhunt, not the staged crime scene, not the London arrest. The children, their names, their ages. The 9-year-old and the 7-year-old who deserved to grow up and who did not. The 11-year-old who will carry the weight of December 19, 2023, forward for the rest of her life. For child welfare advocates, the Singler case is a reminder that the safety of children within a home cannot always be assessed from outside it. Warning signs are not always visible. The most dangerous situations for children are sometimes the least visible ones from the outside. The ones that exist behind closed doors, in families that do not present the obvious markers of instability that activate institutional responses. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4453 exists as a resource for moments of uncertainty. For the family member who has a concern they cannot name precisely. For the community member whose instinct says something is wrong even without clear evidence. Those calls matter. They reach trained counselors who can help assess the situation and connect the caller with the resources available. The Court of El Paso County will carry Kimberly Singler's case through the legal process. Whatever sentence the court ultimately imposes will be imposed in the names of the children who did not survive December 19, 2023. This community carries something alongside that formal process. The commitment to remember those children, to honor the seriousness of their loss, and to hold the truth of what happened to them with the care and the weight it demands. If this case moved you, please like this video, leave a comment in honor of those children. Every story we tell here represents a life that mattered and a community obligation to pay attention. Case 9, Kelly Turner. 2012 through August 2017. Sentenced February 2022. Douglas County District Court, Colorado. There are crimes that investigators encounter which require them to fundamentally recalibrate their understanding of what a criminal act can look like. Most crimes leave physical evidence that is identifiable and interpretable through established forensic protocols. Most criminal acts have a moment, a specific, locatable moment, in which the harm occurred. The case of Kelly Turner and her daughter, Olivia Gant, belongs to a different category entirely. It is a case in which the crime extended across years, in which the harm was inflicted not through a single act, but through an accumulation of acts, each one embedded in the institutional machinery of the medical system, each one invisible because it was disguised as care. It is a case in which the most dangerous place Olivia Gant occupied was not an unsafe home or a dangerous neighborhood, but a hospital room, a room surrounded by doctors and nurses and all the resources of modern medicine, none of which could protect her from the person who had brought her there. Kelly Turner's daughter, Olivia Gant, was a child who was, by all external appearances, profoundly ill. That was the story Turner told, to doctors, to hospitals, to the charitable organizations that rallied around Olivia's case, to the media outlets that covered her story, to the donors who contributed money to support a family dealing with the crushing burden of a terminally ill child. Olivia had a feeding tube. She had undergone surgical procedures. She had been through the kind of medical intervention that marks a child as genuinely, severely sick in ways that are visible and documentable, and that generate the outpouring of support from communities that respond to children in medical crisis. The problem, the catastrophic, years-long problem that investigators would eventually uncover, was that Olivia was not ill. The illnesses were fabricated. The medical necessity of the procedures she underwent was manufactured through the information that Turner provided to the physicians treating Olivia. Information that was false, that was strategically constructed to produce the diagnostic conclusions Turner wanted, and that was delivered with enough consistency and apparent medical literacy to deceive the professionals who relied on parental account as a component of pediatric diagnosis. The condition that Turner's behavior exemplifies, Munchausen syndrome by proxy, now more commonly referred to in clinical literature as factitious disorder imposed on another, is one of the most complex and in many ways most insidious forms of child abuse that the medical and legal systems encounter, precisely because it is conducted within the medical system itself, using the institutional trust placed in parents as the vector for harm. From approximately 2012 through 2017, Kelly Turner subjected her daughter to medical interventions that Olivia did not need, and that caused her harm. Olivia Gant underwent surgeries, multiple, invasive procedures, that were performed on the basis of the false clinical picture that Turner had constructed. She was placed in hospice care. Doctors, working from the information Turner had provided and the medical presentation that years of unnecessary procedures had produced, were persuaded to make the recommendation to withdraw life support. Olivia Gant lost her life in August of 2017. She was 7 years old. Alongside the medical abuse of her daughter, Turner had been running a parallel operation of financial exploitation. The charitable organizations that respond to children in medical crisis, including Make-A-Wish, which fulfills wishes for children with life-threatening conditions, were deceived by Turner's fabricated medical narrative. Olivia was presented to these organizations as a child with terminal illness, and the donations and charitable support that followed flowed to Turner on the basis of that false presentation. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were collected by Turner through fraudulent charitable solicitations, through online fundraising built on a story that was entirely constructed. The investigation into what had happened to Olivia Gant began after her death, initiated by individuals in the medical community who had concerns about the clinical picture Turner had presented over the years and who raised those concerns through the appropriate channels. The criminal investigation that followed required a step that is as unusual as the crime that necessitated it: the exhumation of Olivia's body. Investigators needed to establish the actual physical state of Olivia's health independent of the medical records that Turner had influenced, and the post-mortem examination provided evidence that supported the conclusion that the child had not suffered from the terminal conditions her mother had claimed. Kelly Turner was arrested in 2019, 2 years after Olivia's death. The charges against her spanned the full scope of what she had done: child abuse resulting in death, theft, and charitable fraud. The Douglas County District Attorney's Office prosecuted a case of extraordinary complexity, one that required presenting to a court not just the facts of a single criminal act, but the pattern of a years-long deception conducted through medical institutions, charitable organizations, and the public narrative that Turner had built around a child whose suffering was real, but whose illnesses were not. Turner entered guilty pleas to the charges against her. In February of 2022, the Douglas County District Court sentenced Kelly Turner to 16 years in a Colorado State Correctional Facility. The sentence reflected the court's assessment of the crimes as established through the guilty pleas and the evidence. 16 years that represented the court's formal accounting for what Turner had done to Olivia across those 5 years of fabricated illness, unnecessary medical intervention, charitable fraud, and ultimately the death of a 7-year-old girl whose brief life had been spent in hospitals and procedures that she never should have needed. The Kelly Turner case prompted significant discussion within the medical community about the detection of factitious disorder imposed on another, about the protocols that allow physicians to identify when a parent's account of a child's symptoms diverges from what clinical examination reveals, about the mechanisms for sharing concerns across the medical providers who see a child over time, and about the safeguards that can be put in place to protect children who are brought repeatedly for medical intervention on the basis of parental report. These are not simple conversations, and they do not have simple solutions, because they require medical professionals to balance the fundamental requirement of trusting parental account, which is essential to pediatric care, with the vigilance that protects children from the rare but devastating cases in which that trust is weaponized. For the general public, the Turner case is a reminder that the instincts of people in the medical system who notice something that doesn't add up, who feel that the clinical picture they are being shown and the story they are being told do not fully align, are instincts that deserve to be acted on. The medical community has channels for raising those concerns, including Child Protective Services consultation, ethics committee review, and direct communication between providers. Using those channels is not a betrayal of the family. It is the protection of the child. Olivia Gant was 7 years old when she lost her life in August of 2017. She spent years of her short life in medical settings, subjected to interventions she did not need, carrying the weight of illnesses she did not have. She deserved a childhood, a healthy, ordinary, unmedicated childhood full of the experiences that 7-year-olds are supposed to have. She deserved to grow up. The Douglas County Court gave her 16 years of accountability. This community gives her something more: the refusal to let her story be forgotten, the insistence that her name be spoken with care, and the commitment to carry the lesson of her case forward in every conversation about how communities and medical institutions protect the children who cannot protect themselves. If Olivia's story reached you today, please like this video, leave her name in the comments. These stories need to be heard by the communities that can learn from them and honor the children at their center. Case 10, Miriam Gallegos. May 2007. Denver District Court. Denver, Colorado. On a spring day in May of 2007, Miriam Gallegos walked into a Denver police station and delivered a story that sent officers into the streets immediately and set in motion one of the most intensive missing child searches in the city's recent history. Her 3-year-old daughter, Nevaeh Gallegos, had been taken, torn from her arms, she said, by a stranger, a kidnapper who had appeared without warning in a Denver park and seized the child while her mother was present, pulling Nevaeh away and disappearing with her before Miriam could do anything to prevent it. The story was terrifying. It was the kind of story that activates every emergency response mechanism a city has, because a missing 3-year-old taken by a stranger is one of the most urgent law enforcement situations that exists. Denver police mobilized. The search for Nevaeh Gallegos began. In the hours and days that followed, Denver law enforcement deployed the full scope of resources available for a missing child emergency. Search teams worked the park and the surrounding areas. The public appeal went out. The description of Nevaeh, the circumstances of her disappearance as Miriam Gallegos had described them, the call for anyone with information to come forward. The community responded the way communities respond to missing child emergencies, with concern, with attention, with the shared urgency of people who understand that a 3-year-old is somewhere she should not be and that finding her matters. But as the search continued and investigators worked deeper into the circumstances Miriam Gallegos had described, the story she had told began to present inconsistencies. Experienced investigators who have worked missing child cases develop a professional sensitivity to the elements of an account that do not quite fit, the details that are too precise or not precise enough, the emotional response that doesn't match what the situation would produce, the timeline that doesn't hold up when it is mapped against the verifiable facts. The account Gallegos had provided began to generate those inconsistencies under the systematic scrutiny that detectives brought to it. The search that began with the kidnapping story ended with an intensive investigation that located Nevaeh's body. She was found buried in a ravine. 3-year-old Nevaeh Gallegos had not been taken by a stranger in a Denver park. She had not been carried away by an unknown kidnapper who had disappeared into the city. She had never left the orbit of the people who were responsible for her care. What investigators determined through their examination of the evidence was that Nevaeh had lost her life as a result of a pattern of prolonged, severe abuse inflicted by her mother's boyfriend, Angel Ray Montoya, and that Miriam Gallegos had not only been aware of what was happening to her daughter, but had actively participated in concealing it. The fabricated kidnapping story was not a spontaneous act of panic. It was a calculated construction, a narrative designed to direct the attention of law enforcement outward, toward an invented perpetrator, and away from the household where the truth of what had happened to Nevaeh actually lived. Gallegos had walked into a police station and delivered that story knowing what she knew about her daughter's fate and who was responsible for it. She had activated the city's missing child response system as a mechanism of concealment, using the public's genuine concern for Nevaeh as a tool to obscure the accountability that the child's death required. Angel Ray Montoya and Miriam Gallegos were both taken into custody as the investigation reached its conclusions. The cases against them were prosecuted through the Denver District Court with the seriousness that the evidence demanded. Montoya, who investigators established had directly caused the harm that ended Nevaeh's life through a pattern of prolonged abuse, was charged with first-degree murder. Miriam Gallegos, whose criminal responsibility centered on the concealment, the cover-up, the false kidnapping narrative, the active participation in preventing accountability, was charged with child abuse resulting in death and accessory to a crime. The legal proceedings produced outcomes that the Denver District Court delivered with the weight of what it was accounting for. Angel Ray Montoya was convicted of first-degree murder by a jury and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The conviction and the sentence reflected the jury's determination that what Montoya had done to 3-year-old Nevaeh Gallegos, over a pattern of sustained harm, was among the gravest criminal acts that Colorado law addresses. Miriam Gallegos, prosecuted separately for her role in the concealment and her guilty plea to child abuse resulting in death and accessory to a crime, received a sentence of 12 years in prison in 2008. The 12-year sentence was calibrated to the nature of her specific criminal responsibility, not as the direct cause of Nevaeh's death, but as the person who had known what was happening to her daughter, who had failed to protect her, and who had then constructed a false narrative designed to prevent the accountability that Nevaeh deserved. 12 years against a life, against the 3 years of life that Nevaeh Gallegos had, and against the decades she deserved. It is a sentence that reflects the particular legal calculation of accessory liability and concealment, distinct from the first-degree murder conviction that sent Montoya to prison for life. For some, the disparity between those sentences is itself a subject of ongoing conversation in the child advocacy community, a conversation about how the law calibrates accountability for parents who do not directly cause harm, but who stand aside and then actively conceal it. Nevaeh Gallegos was 3 years old in May of 2007. She was at the age of wonder, of questions about everything, of the particular intensity with which 3-year-olds engage with the world around them and with the people in it. She had a name that her mother, in some earlier time or some parallel universe of the ordinary, had chosen with the kind of care that parents bring to the names of the children they plan to love. Nevaeh. She deserved everything that name carried with it. She deserved the park her mother claimed to have taken her to, not as the setting for a fabricated story, but as a real place where a real little girl played on a spring afternoon without fear. The investigation and prosecution of the Nevaeh Gallegos case became part of the permanent record of Denver's justice system, a record that names Angel Ray Montoya as the person who ended her life and Miriam Gallegos as the person who knew and concealed it. Both are formally and permanently accountable under the law of Colorado. Montoya will spend the rest of his life in a Colorado correctional facility. Gallegos served her sentence. The court gave what it could. The community gives Nevaeh something no court can legislate. The refusal to let her be forgotten, the insistence that her 3 years of life be honored in the telling of her story, and the commitment to carry the lesson of her case forward into every conversation about the obligation adults have to protect the children in their care. For Denver, for the city that mobilized its resources to search for a little girl who was already gone by the time the search began, the Nevaeh Gallegos case is a permanent reminder of what the stakes are when a child is in a dangerous situation and the adults who know it do not act. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4453, available around the clock every day of the year, exists for the moment when someone knows something is wrong and doesn't know what to do with that knowledge. That call, made before the harm becomes irreversible, is the call that can change everything. Nevaeh Gallegos deserved to grow up in Denver, in the city that searched for her, under the Colorado sky. The law gave her accountability in 2 criminal sentences. This community gives her memory. Her name belongs in the record. Not just the court record of Denver, Colorado, but the record of every person who hears her story and carries it forward with the weight it deserves. This documentary has examined 10 cases of profound child welfare failure in Denver and Colorado. 10 children whose stories demand to be told with seriousness, with respect, and with the commitment to education and accountability that responsible documentary journalism requires. Caden McWilliams, Natalie Hurst-Skinner, Caleb Pacheco, the 2-year-old daughter of Melissa Wayne, Mahaly Hobbs, Gianna Rosales, Leighton Gilmore, the children of Kimberly Singler, Olivia Gant, Nevaeh Gallegos. 10 children, 10 lives that mattered completely and unconditionally. 10 cases where the adults most obligated to provide protection failed in the most absolute ways the law recognizes. The courts of Colorado, the Denver District Court, the Douglas County District Court, the Logan County District Court, the Arapahoe County District Court, the El Paso County District Court, gave each of these cases the formal accounting that the law provides. Sentences were imposed. Convictions were recorded. The legal record of what happened to each of these children was inscribed in the permanent documents of Colorado's justice system. That record matters. It matters to the families. It matters to the advocates who work in the space of child protection. And it matters to the community of people who choose to engage with these stories because they believe that knowing the truth, even when the truth is this hard, is part of the obligation we carry toward children who cannot speak for themselves. If you have watched all 10 of these cases today, you have spent time with something that required courage to sit with. These are not easy stories. They are not stories that resolve into comfort. They resolve into accountability, into legal sentences, into reform conversations that began with tragedy. But they also resolve into the conviction, the absolute, foundational conviction, that every child's life matters, that every child deserves protection, and that the community of people willing to learn these stories and carry them forward is itself a form of advocacy on behalf of children who are no longer here to speak. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline is available at 1-800-422-4453 every hour of every day for anyone with a concern about a child's safety. Use it. Share it. The call that feels unnecessary is often the call that isn't. Thank you for watching Cold Case Hour. If this episode reached you, if it reminded you why this work matters, please like this video, leave a comment with the name of the child whose story stayed with you most today, and subscribe to this channel so you never miss an episode. Share it with someone who needs to hear these stories. These 10 children deserve an audience that doesn't look away, and they deserve to be remembered by name, by every single person who watches this video to the end. We will be back